The newborn dragon should have been a miracle. Instead, it was a crisis no one in the galactic medical spire wanted attached to their record, because the hatchling lying beneath the sterile white glow of anti-radiation panels was not just any creature but the first draconic lifeform ever born off-world, the product of a fragile diplomatic alliance between Earth and the high-gravity world of Varanth, where dragons were not myths but apex sentients whose physiology combined plasma-generating organs, crystalline bone lattices, and dual-core circulatory systems that baffled even the most advanced alien medics. Yet from the moment the egg cracked inside its reinforced incubation chamber, alarms had screamed through the facility as the hatchling's internal temperatures fluctuated wildly, its secondary heart stuttered, and its fire sac failed to ignite properly, leaving the tiny creature gasping in thin, mechanical breaths while a ring of multi-limbed surgeons and luminous-skinned xenobiologists hovered in frustration, their instruments humming uselessly against biology they thought they understood but clearly did not. One by one, the alien specialists attempted intervention, adjusting plasma regulators, stimulating neural pathways with bioelectric pulses, infusing synthetic oxygen substitutes calibrated for Varantha's atmosphere, yet nothing stabilized the newborn for longer than a few seconds, and murmurs began circulating in clipped, harmonic tones that perhaps the off-world birth had destabilized the species' delicate combustion cycle, that perhaps dragons simply could not survive beyond their native planetary pressure and magnetic field alignment. Commander Threx, the imposing draconic ambassador whose scales shimmered like molten bronze under the surgical lights, watched in rigid silence as hope drained from the chamber. His massive wings held tight against reinforced walls, claws carving faint grooves into alloy flooring while medics finally stepped back. In reluctant resignation, pronouncing that the hatchling's metabolic failure was irreversible and recommending termination to prevent prolonged suffering. Their voices clinical, detached, efficient. And that was the moment a human voice broke through the sterile despair, steady and edged with quiet refusal, belonging not to a xenobiologist, not to a decorated war medic, but to Dr. Elias Rowan, a terrestrial veterinarian whose expertise lay not in plasma-based alien physiology but in saving fragile lives no one else believed viable. Foals born too early, exotic reptiles with failing thermoregulation, injured wildlife brought in long after hope should have expired. And though he stood at the far edge of the chamber in a simple white coat marked with Earth's blue insignia, he stepped forward without hesitation, meeting the ambassador's blazing eyes without flinching and said calmly, "You're treating this hatchling like a machine that needs recalibration. It's not. It's a newborn that's never felt what it's supposed to feel." Words that drew incredulous glances from alien medics who had spent centuries mastering biological engineering far beyond humanity's crude surgical traditions. When challenged, Elias did not argue credentials but requested something far simpler. Remove half the equipment, lower the sterile light intensity, raise ambient temperature gradually rather than artificially spiking internal heat, and most controversially, allow physical contact from the parent, because in every species he had ever treated, from mammals to scaled reptiles, stress hormones in neonates could shut down essential survival systems, and he suspected that the hatchling's failure to ignite its fire sac was not purely mechanical but neurological. A panic response in an environment saturated with alien scent signatures and invasive instrumentation. Outrage rippled through the chamber at the suggestion of reducing intervention. But Commander Threx, desperate beyond pride, growled a single word of command that silenced objection, and within minutes the chamber transformed from a surgical theater into something closer to a nest. Lights dimmed to amber warmth, humming devices powered down, the metallic tang of disinfectant replaced by heat and the faint mineral scent of draconic scales, and Elias carefully approached the struggling hatchling, noting the irregular tremor in its limbs, the faint flicker beneath translucent scales where the fire sac lay dormant like an unlit ember. Instead of injecting another stimulant, he placed his gloved hand gently against the creature's chest, feeling the uneven rhythm of the dual hearts, murmuring in low, steady tones not in the draconic language but in the calm cadence he used with frightened animals on Earth, voice even, reassuring, grounded in presence rather than panic. And when Commander Threx hesitated only a fraction of a second before lowering his massive head beside the incubator, exhaling a slow, controlled stream of warm breath across the hatchling's body, something shifted, subtle at first. A stabilization in heart rhythm, a lessening of tremor, and Elias nodded quietly, instructing the ambassador to continue steady thermal breathing instead of surging flame, to let the hatchling feel regulated warmth rather than explosive ignition. Minutes stretched heavy and uncertain, alien medics watching with skepticism edged by reluctant curiosity, until a faint glow pulsed beneath the newborn's chest, weak but present, a spark not forced by chemical override but coaxed into existence by environmental stability and parental proximity, and Elias leaned closer, eyes sharp with cautious hope, whispering, "There you go. That's yours, not ours." As the ember brightened fractionally, the first self-generated heat signature since birth flickering like a sunrise struggling through storm clouds, and in that fragile glow lay the beginning of a defiance no one in the galactic medical spire had anticipated, not technological superiority, not advanced alien precision, but human stubbornness grounded in empathy, a refusal to surrender a life simply because it did not respond to conventional control. And though the hatchling was far from stable, though its breathing remained shallow and its fire sac barely functional, the monitors now displayed something they had not shown before. Self-sustained internal heat, faint but undeniably real. And as alien medics exchanged astonished glances, Elias Rowan did not celebrate, did not claim victory, but simply adjusted the environmental controls another fraction of a degree and prepared for the long, relentless fight ahead, because in his experience, saving a newborn was never about a single dramatic moment. It was about refusing to walk away when everyone else already had. The fragile ember inside the newborn dragon's chest did not become a steady flame overnight, and Dr. Elias Rowan knew better than to mistake a spark for survival, because over the next 48 hours the hatchling's condition wavered like a candle in crosswind, its dual hearts slipping in and out of synchronization, its crystalline bone structure struggling to properly mineralize under off-world gravity, and its fire sac producing inconsistent bursts of heat that left the surrounding medical team alternating between cautious optimism and renewed despair. Yet where the alien medics saw erratic instability, Elias saw patterns, subtle responses to touch, to sound, to temperature shifts, patterns that reminded him not of alien machinery but of vulnerable neonates on Earth whose survival depended as much on environment and emotional regulation as on chemistry, and so he insisted on maintaining the nest-like chamber they had improvised, dim amber lighting replacing sterile glare, thermal gradients adjusted gradually instead of sharply. Commander Threx allowed extended presence beside the incubator despite diplomatic obligations, and although several senior xenophysiologists objected that such measures were sentiment-driven variables, Elias countered with measured data, pointing to cortisol-equivalent markers in the hatchling's bloodstream that spiked whenever unfamiliar medics crowded too close or equipment noise intensified, arguing that stress suppression was not sentimental but physiological. Reluctantly, the medical board granted him provisional authority over neonatal protocol, a decision born more of desperation than faith, and Elias immediately implemented what he termed a stability cycle, combining carefully moderated heat exposure from the ambassador's controlled breath, rhythmic auditory input from low-frequency harmonic tones calibrated to mimic Varantha's natural tectonic resonance, and gentle tactile stimulation timed with the hatchling's weaker heart to encourage synchronization with the stronger one, essentially teaching the two cardiac systems to communicate through patterned sensory reinforcement, a method that drew skepticism bordering on ridicule from a species accustomed to direct surgical correction, but Elias persisted, documenting every fluctuation, every micro-adjustment, refusing to treat the dragon like an engine requiring recalibration, and instead treating it like a newborn whose systems needed guidance rather than override. Progress was maddeningly incremental, 1 hour of steady temperature followed by sudden drops, moments of coordinated heartbeat collapsing into arrhythmic tremors, and twice the hatchling's breathing faltered so severely that alien medics moved instinctively to initiate termination protocol, only for Elias to block them physically, his voice sharp with uncharacteristic anger as he demanded time, pointing to faint but present adaptive responses that indicated neurological engagement, rather than systemic shutdown, and Commander Threx's massive frame positioned itself beside the human in silent support, a gesture that shifted the room's power dynamic more decisively than any argument. On the third day, a breakthrough arrived not with dramatic spectacle but with subtle resilience, as the hatchling's fire sac ignited spontaneously for a full 7 seconds without artificial stimulation, producing a controlled internal warmth that spread evenly through its bloodstream instead of spiking dangerously, and Elias nearly sagged with relief as data streams confirmed that the secondary heart had matched rhythm to the primary for the duration of ignition. Evidence that the sensory conditioning was fostering internal coordination rather than forced compliance. However, survival demanded more than heat generation, because off-world gravity continued to strain the developing skeletal lattice, and microfractures began forming along the wing joints where crystalline bone met. Flexible cartilage, a complication that sent alien surgeons into renewed debate over invasive reinforcement implants, yet Elias proposed a different approach. Adaptive resistance therapy, gradually introducing variable gravity fields within the chamber to strengthen bone deposition naturally instead of locking the structure into rigid artificial supports that could impair future flight, and though the concept seemed dangerously experimental, he supported it with comparative studies from Earth's veterinary orthopedics showing how controlled stress promoted stronger healing than immobilization alone. With grudging approval, the chamber's gravity regulators were recalibrated in minute increments, and Elias monitored the hatchling through each adjustment, guiding Commander Threx in positioning his wings to create stabilizing air currents, effectively transforming the ambassador from helpless observer into active participant in rehabilitation. A collaboration that deepened the bond not only between parent and offspring but between species, as alien medics witnessed a human integrating emotional intelligence with scientific reasoning in ways their own protocols had overlooked. Still, setbacks came relentlessly, including a terrifying episode when the hatchling's fire sac overcompensated during a gravity shift, releasing a burst of uncontrolled plasma that scorched the chamber's inner shielding and nearly triggered automatic suppression systems, and for a moment chaos reigned. As alarms shrieked and medics scrambled, but Elias reacted not with panic but with swift recalibration, ordering a reduction in oxygen density and guiding Threx to emit a steady cooling breath rather than flame, stabilizing the thermal spike before it cascaded into organ failure, and afterward, while others muttered about recklessness, Elias calmly reviewed data logs, identifying the precise gravity threshold that had triggered overcompensation and adjusting future increments accordingly. By the end of the first week, the hatchling could maintain internal heat for several minutes at a time. Its dual hearts synchronized nearly 80% of each cycle, its wing joints showing measurable strengthening without invasive implants, and though it remained fragile, dependent on monitored conditions and parental presence, it was undeniably alive through its own effort rather than artificial override, a distinction that carried profound weight within draconic culture, where self-sustained flame symbolized not merely biology but identity. Whispers spread beyond the medical spire, across diplomatic channels and interstellar networks, about the human veterinarian who refused termination and instead rewrote neonatal protocol through patience, environmental adaptation, and sheer refusal to concede defeat, and some called him reckless, others visionary. But within the amberlit chamber where a once doomed hatchling now shifted with faint but purposeful movements, Elias Rowan did not dwell on reputation, because each measured breath, each steady flicker of internal fire, reminded him that survival was not granted by advanced technology alone but earned through relentless care, observation, and the courage to challenge consensus when consensus meant surrender. And as he rested a weary hand against the incubator wall, watching the newborn dragon's chest rise with fragile determination, he understood that the real battle was far from over, yet for the first time since the egg had cracked under sterile lights, hope no longer felt like defiance against inevitability, but like a growing flame finding its own reason to burn. By the beginning of the second week, survival was no longer the only question hanging over the neonatal chamber. Now the debate had shifted toward sustainability, toward whether the newborn dragon could one day leave the controlled amber cocoon and exist in the broader galactic environment without constant intervention, and that question carried political weight as heavy as gravity itself, because the hatchling was more than a patient. It was a symbol of alliance between Earth and Varanth, living testament to cooperation or a looming reminder of failure, and while Dr. Elias Rowan remained focused on heart rhythms and bone density scans, he was acutely aware of the tension thickening the corridors outside, of council members arriving in polished armor and sterile robes to observe through reinforced glass, whispering about contingency plans should the experiment of off-world draconic birth prove fundamentally flawed. Inside the chamber, however, progress continued in fragile increments, the hatchling now able to hold a steady internal temperature for nearly an hour without assisted breath from Commander Threx, its dual hearts synchronizing with increasing reliability, the once erratic pulses smoothing into coordinated strength, and Elias began introducing controlled external stimuli beyond thermal and gravitational adjustments. Subtle changes in light spectrum to simulate Varunth's sun cycles, low-frequency vibration pulses to mimic tectonic shifts native to the Dragon homeworld, even recorded harmonic calls from draconic elders to provide auditory familiarity, because he understood that development was not merely mechanical but neurological, and deprivation of species-specific stimuli could stunt growth as surely as oxygen deprivation. The alien medics, though still divided in private opinion, had largely ceased open opposition, partly because the data now supported Elias's methods, and partly because Commander Threx's imposing presence discouraged overt dissent, yet skepticism lingered in quieter forms, particularly when Elias proposed the next phase of care. Gradual exposure beyond the incubator, a process that would require trust in the hatchling's adaptive capacity rather than constant containment, and when he presented the plan before the medical council, detailing phased reductions in environmental shielding, monitored introduction to standard atmospheric composition, and supervised mobility exercises, several senior xenobiologists warned that even minor miscalculations could undo weeks of fragile progress, but Elias countered that indefinite protection could become its own form of harm, arguing that resilience develops through measured challenge, not perpetual insulation, and after tense deliberation, conditional approval was granted. The first exposure session was almost anticlimactic in appearance yet monumental in implication, as the incubator's upper field dissolved into open air while gravity remained stabilized. And for a suspended heartbeat nothing happened, the hatchling lying still beneath the dim glow, scales shimmering faintly, before its small claws flexed against the nest lining and its eyes, clearer now, brighter, opened wider than they ever had within enclosed walls, sensing space rather than confinement, and Elias held his breath not out of fear but reverence, recognizing that this was the first true choice the creature had been given, the choice to move or remain, and slowly, with a trembling effort that seemed to draw from every ounce of newly forged strength, the hatchling lifted its head without collapsing, its secondary heart maintaining rhythm, its fire sac flickering not in distress but in curious response to unfamiliar airflow brushing its scales. Commander Threx lowered his massive frame nearby, careful not to overshadow the fragile figure, emitting a low harmonic rumble of encouragement that vibrated through the floor, and Elias knelt opposite, palms open, offering neither command nor assistance unless requested, and in that triangle of trust, parent, healer, newborn, the first tentative movement beyond the incubator occurred as the hatchling dragged one forelimb forward, claws scraping softly against alloy, wings twitching with the faintest spark of instinct, and though the distance covered was barely the length of its own body, the significance reverberated through the chamber like a thunderclap, because nothing failed, nothing destabilized, the hearts continued. Synchronized, the fire sac glowed steady rather than volatile. Sessions lengthened gradually over the next days, each monitored meticulously, and with each successful exposure the hatchling's musculature strengthened, crystalline bones adapting to standard gravity without microfracture, wing joints articulating with increasing confidence until one evening, as Elias adjusted atmospheric composition to full baseline for the first time, an unexpected development unfolded, the hatchling's fire sac. Ignited not in survival reflex but in deliberate projection, a small but controlled plume of flame arcing upward before dissipating safely against reinforced shielding, and silence consumed the chamber as every observer registered the shift from reactive physiology to intentional expression, the defining trait of draconic sentience. Yet triumph carried risk, because increased metabolic activity strained energy reserves, and within hours the hatchling exhibited signs of exhaustion, heart rates dipping precariously, and alien medics prepared emergency stabilization measures, but Elias intervened with a quieter solution, guiding Commander Threx to position the hatchling beneath his wing in direct skin-to-scale contact, reintroducing the simplest and most ancient regulator, parental warmth. And as the newborn settled against that living furnace, breathing gradually evening out, Elias realized that technology had carried them only so far. The rest depended on relationships, on biological truths older than space travel, and in the days that followed, something remarkable occurred not only within the hatchling but within the medical team itself, as alien specialists began integrating Elias's environmental and relational protocols into standard xenoneonatal procedure drafts, acknowledging that advanced intervention and emotional context were not opposing philosophies but complementary forces. The turning point arrived during an unannounced inspection by the Interstellar Council. whose members expected to witness a fragile creature clinging to life support, but instead observed a young dragon standing unassisted in stabilized gravity, wings partially unfurled, eyes alert and aware, a faint internal glow pulsing steadily beneath translucent scales, and when prompted by Commander Threx's gentle rumble, the hatchling released a controlled flare that illuminated the chamber in gold rather than chaotic white heat. The display brief yet intentional, and in that light the Council saw not a liability but a future, not a diplomatic embarrassment but proof that cooperation between species could yield outcomes neither could achieve alone. Afterward, as officials departed in subdued contemplation, Elias remained kneeling on the chamber floor, exhaustion finally seeping into his bones, watching the hatchling wobble toward him with unsteady but determined steps, and when it pressed its scaled forehead lightly against his chest, a gesture unmistakably chosen rather than reflexive. He felt the steady double heartbeat through his coat and understood that the battle had shifted from survival to growth, from defiance against death to preparation for life, and though challenges undoubtedly awaited beyond the controlled safety of the medical spire, the newborn dragon was no longer a fading ember in sterile isolation but a self-sustaining flame learning to burn on its own terms, and Elias, the human veterinarian who refused to surrender when every alien medic had stepped back, knew that the true measure of success was not that he had saved a dragon, but that the dragon now possessed the strength to save itself. The day the hatchling was cleared to leave the neonatal chamber, the galactic medical spire felt less like a hospital and more like a threshold between eras, because what stepped carefully, deliberately, beyond the amberlit containment field was no longer a fragile anomaly defying death, but a young dragon whose survival had already rewritten interstellar medical doctrine. And as gravity normalized fully and standard atmospheric composition settled around scaled lungs that once struggled for every breath, Dr. Elias Rowan stood a few paces back, arms folded not in distance but in restraint, allowing the moment to belong first to Commander Threx and his child. The hatchling's wings extended experimentally, catching circulating air currents from the spire's climate systems, crystalline bones flexing without fracture, dual hearts beating in synchronized cadence that no longer required rhythmic prompting, and when it exhaled a measured plume of golden flame that arced upward without destabilizing into wild plasma, a murmur rippled through the assembled observers. Alien medics, council delegates, Earth representatives. Because they were witnessing more than recovery, they were witnessing adaptation, the rare and powerful confirmation that life could recalibrate itself when given understanding instead of control. Yet discharge from intensive care did not mean the end of uncertainty, for the broader galactic community remained divided on whether this success represented replicable science or a singular exception born of unusual circumstances, and whispers circulated about risk, about whether future off-world births would justify the resources invested, about whether reliance on a human veterinarian's unconventional methods could be standardized across species whose biology defied familiar models, and Elias heard those whispers without resentment, knowing skepticism was not malice but caution shaped by centuries of precedent. Still, he also knew that the most profound transformation had occurred not in data logs but in perspective, because alien medics who once dismissed environmental and relational variables as sentimental noise now incorporated them into official xenoneonatal protocols, drafting guidelines that mandated parental integration, gradual stimulus adaptation, and stress hormone monitoring as foundational rather than auxiliary procedures. And at the heart of those revisions was the recognition that advanced technology did not negate ancient biological truths. It enhanced them when applied with humility. The true test arrived sooner than expected when a delegation from another high-gravity species requested consultation for their own failing neonate, a creature whose internal cooling system malfunctioned under artificial incubation, and though Elias was not formally assigned to the case, Commander Threx insisted on his inclusion, publicly crediting the human's persistence as the catalyst that saved his child. A declaration that carried diplomatic weight impossible to ignore, and so Elias found himself once again inside a controlled chamber, observing alien physiology vastly different from dragons yet haunted by similar patterns of stress and instability, and rather than impose a rigid template, he asked first about environmental context, about parental proximity, about sensory deprivation, guiding the alien team to examine not only what the newborn lacked chemically but what it lacked experientially. And when stabilization followed through environmental recalibration rather than invasive override, resistance softened across sectors that once scoffed at his approach. Meanwhile, the dragon hatchling, now stronger, larger, flame steady and gaze bright with emerging intelligence. Began structured mobility training within reinforced flight corridors of the spire, its first true glide less a dramatic ascent and more an awkward hop sustained by instinct and careful wing-beat timing. Yet even that brief lift from the floor drew applause from hardened diplomats unaccustomed to celebrating incremental progress, and Elias watched with quiet pride as the creature corrected its balance mid-air, compensating for airflow variance without panic. A sign not merely of physical strength but neurological confidence forged through weeks of patient conditioning. As months unfolded, the hatchling's presence became a symbol threaded through diplomatic discourse, invoked in councils as evidence that cooperation between Earth and Varanth produced outcomes neither could achieve in isolation, and Commander Threx frequently cited the human veterinarian's refusal to accept termination as the moment alliance shifted from political necessity to genuine partnership, because trust had been earned not through treaties but through shared vigil beside a fragile life. Yet for Elias, the most meaningful moments occurred far from council chambers, in quiet observation rooms where the young dragon practiced controlled ignition sequences, experimenting with flame intensity and duration under minimal supervision, occasionally glancing toward the human who once shielded it from surrender, and one evening, during a supervised session transitioning to open-air atmospheric conditions for the first time, a minor malfunction in climate regulators triggered an abrupt pressure fluctuation that would once have spelled disaster, but instead of spiraling into metabolic collapse, the dragon adjusted posture, stabilized breathing, and modulated its internal heat autonomously, dual hearts maintaining rhythm through adaptive recalibration. And in that calm self-correction, Elias felt a deeper triumph than any dramatic rescue could offer, because resilience had replaced fragility as the creature's defining trait. Later, as the spire's lights dimmed to simulate planetary dusk, the dragon approached him without summons, lowering its now formidable head until scaled brow met human palm in a deliberate gesture echoing that first fragile touch weeks ago, and Elias felt the steady synchronized pulse beneath his hand. No longer a desperate flicker but a confident cadence, and though dragons did not speak in human language, the intent was unmistakable. A recognition not of ownership or dependence but of shared journey, of survival shaped by partnership. In the cycles that followed, training expanded beyond medical corridors into diplomatic arenas, the young dragon accompanying Commander Threx to interstellar assemblies as living testament to adaptation across worlds, and each time observers marveled at its controlled flame and poised bearing. The narrative quietly included the human who refused to let it die, reshaping not only neonatal care but the philosophy underpinning interspecies collaboration. And when historians later documented the first off-world draconic birth that survived against consensus, they would note technological innovations and revised protocols. Yet beneath those formal records lay a simpler truth, that amid sterile lights and calculated probabilities, one human veterinarian chose presence over resignation, patience over procedure, and stubborn hope over statistical inevitability, and in doing so ignited a chain of transformation that extended far beyond a single hatchling's heartbeat, proving that even in a galaxy defined by ancient power and advanced science, it sometimes takes the quiet defiance of one ordinary individual to remind civilizations that life is not sustained by control alone, but by understanding, courage, and the unwavering refusal to walk away when a flame still struggles to burn.